All right, we're back to dealing with apostolic succession, how these three positions became part of a hierarchy that the church used for the church's authority, church being the ecclesia, and how in the first century there were elders and deacons, and the position of overseer seems to fall to the elders, not as a function, not as a position, but as we moved into the second century, it became an official position. And there was a bishop and elders and deacons in churches. So we're going to go a little bit further into this, from the overseeing elders to the overseen elders, and look at some of the writings that kind of show us how this went. So we're going to start with Clement, who lived during the first century and ended up being in the second, third, or fourth bishop of Rome. And we looked at what he said pertaining to this, which he only leaves us with the idea that there are elders who work as overseers. So but he does talk about succession. He talks about being obedient to those who have rule over you. So these positions did have authority over the congregations, giving fit honor to the presbyters, so the elders. He also talks about how this was a succession, just like you see reflected in Christ and the Father. Christ, therefore, was sent forth by God, and the apostles by Christ. So to continue that, by these appointments then were made in an orderly way according to the will of God, and that the apostles appointed the first fruits, having proved them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons. So the apostles continued appointing, and then the apostles knew that there would be strife because of these created positions, because whoever has authority, there's going to be someone else who wants that authority. And so they appointed those already mentioned, and afterwards gave them instructions that when these should fall asleep, other approved men should succeed them. So this creates this notion of succession by appointment. We're going to see that there's another way that there was succession too in this early period, which we've talked about before, but I want to emphasize it, and we'll look at that in just a second. From there, we're going to go to Ignatius. We talked about Ignatius before. Ignatius was martyred, and he was the bishop of Antioch, and through some sort of intrigue, he was accused and turned over to the government, to the Romans, and was taken to Rome and executed. And there's a lot of controversy about exactly what went on there and why, because the story that is told later by Eusebius and some of the others about how all this took place doesn't make a lot of sense for the period, and so it's not clear how all this took place. But anyway, on that route, he wrote 7 letters, and those epistles have been retained, and there's a lot of information in there that what was happening in this time period. So he died either before 117, because Eusebius and a few others indicate that he died when Trajan was the emperor. But again, there's things that take place that make people think that that was not really the case, that he actually died much later, in the 140s maybe, which is more consistent with the way he talks about the organization of the church. But so either one of these could be the case. And he's said to be a disciple of the Apostle John. So others say about him that he knew the Apostle John. He actually says himself that was not the case. He doesn't deny that, but he says that he knew people who knew John, which is not exactly the same thing. So you could say he was a follower of the Apostle John. He probably didn't actually know John. But this helps confirm the idea that John lived a long time. He lived at least into the 90s, and so people living in this time could have known him. This is where what I wanted you to see that Ignatius said in his letter to the Smyrnians. He says this: all follow the bishop. So everyone should follow the bishop. He's talking about one bishop, as Jesus Christ does the Father, and the presbytery, the elders, as you would the apostles, and reverence the deacons as being the institution of God. Let no one do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, communion, which is either by the bishop or by one to whom he has entrusted it. Whenever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude also be. So there shouldn't be any assemblies without the presence of the bishop. Even as wherever Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. But this word Catholic means general. So in other words, what he was saying was the entire church, not an individual church. So there's the whole church and there's an individual church in each city. So that's how he's using this phrase here. So he says, let the multitude also be, even as where Jesus Christ is, there is the whole Catholic Church. So that's the relationship of the bishop in a local church to Jesus and the whole church. That's why he's saying this. It is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast, but whatsoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. So this is part of the reason that it seems like maybe he's writing in a later time, because 110 to 117, somewhere in there, seems a bit early for this idea that there's a single bishop in every church and you have to do what they say. He's the only one that said this early. So if that was already going on and he was talking about it that early, that's a big jump from Clement, which was just a few years earlier. So, but you see that this is starting to form, this notion that there is a bishop in a church and he has say over whatever takes place. Another person from that same period, but a little later, Eusebius, gives us a slightly different view of this. And we don't have anything that he actually wrote directly, but Eusebius wrote several things into his history of the church that Eusebius said. So using those, more than likely he was a Jewish Christian. So he had a slightly different take on things than the Greeks did, the Gentiles did. So he also wrote a church history, and that's what this comes from. Here's his description of the early period, and we've talked about this before. So you remember James, Jesus's half-brother, became the leader of the church at Jerusalem. And that's what it's talking about here. So after James the just had suffered martyrdom, as had the Lord also, and on the same account, for the same reason, again Simeon, the son of Clopas, descended from the Lord's uncle, is made bishop, his election being promoted by all as being a kinsman of the Lord. So when James was martyred, they got Simeon, who was descended from the Lord's uncle. His descendant, Simeon, is made the bishop in Jerusalem, who was the one who was considered the leader of the church in Jerusalem, just like James had been. Why did they get Simeon to be the bishop? This is the transition of power through blood that you're used to with kings. Slightly after that, he goes on. There still survived of the kindred of the Lord the grandsons of Judas, who according to the flesh was called his brother. These were informed against as belonging to the family of David, and Ignatius brought them before Domitian Caesar. What he's talking about here in this first paragraph happens before the fall of Jerusalem. What we're talking about here happens in the 90s. So this is after the fall of Jerusalem. And it talks about that there are grandsons of Judas, who was Jesus' actual half brother, listed in the Gospels. So here, there are still these grandsons, and they get brought before Caesar as being accused of belonging to the family of David. What is that saying? Well, Jesus was crucified because he was claiming to be the Messiah of the bloodline of David. So he was challenging the throne of Rome because he was king of the Jews. Well, if you're in the line of David, you can be you can be the king of the Jews. So that's why they were being accused here, because they were in the bloodline of David. When they were released, Domitian released them because he didn't see them as a threat, but he released them and they became leaders of the churches, as was natural in the case of those who were once martyrs and of the kindred of the Lord. So they had two claims to authority. They were the kindred of Jesus. They were in the line of Jesus, even though Jesus didn't have children. His brothers did, so they were in some way kin to him. And then also, they had been martyrs. They didn't die, but they had gone to jail. They had gone to prison and suffered. So technically, they would be called confessors in the later periods. And so they had two things to indicate their importance. And so they were leaders in the churches because of this. And so he also points this out. On my arrival at Rome, I drew up a list, and so this is the idea of him being the church historian here. On my arrival at Rome, I drew up a list of the succession of bishops down to Ignatius, whose deacon was Eleutherus. To Ignatius succeeded Soter, and after him came Eleutherus. But in the case of every succession and in every city, the state of affairs is in accordance with the teaching of the law and of the prophets and of the Lord. That last phrase just talking about the fact that it's an orderly transition of power. So people are taking these positions in an orderly way. It's being passed along rather than somebody just declaring themselves to be a leader. So that's how we see all this transition working out here. So even though he was talking about the early transitions in Jerusalem being based on kinship, when he's talking about what takes place in Rome, it's not the same. In Rome, we get back to that previous model that we were talking about, where it's just an apostolic succession. You don't have to be in the bloodline of Jesus or anything like that to get this. Irenaeus, and we're moving a little further along in time. We talked about Irenaeus a lot when we were going through the Gnostics, because he wrote against heresies, against the Gnostics. And so he mentioned something in there of the same idea. It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested through the whole world, and we are in a position to reckon up those who were by the apostles made bishops in the churches, and the succession of these men to our own times. Here we're talking about 200, so we've progressed another 100 years from where we started with Clement, and now they're still talking about this succession taking place through time, starting with the apostles. You had to have hands laid on you that could be traced back to the apostles. Since it would be very tedious in such a volume to reckon up the successions of all the churches, now follow this. He's talking about here, he could go through all the major churches. Next week I'll probably get into some of this major church things. It would be very tedious to go through and give you a list of all the bishops in all the major churches, he says. But we do, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles, what he just talked about, of the very great, the very ancient and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of the bishops. So there's been a succession in Rome that started with Peter and Paul. And now here's the important piece. 200. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church, the Church of Rome. That is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continuously by those who exist everywhere. So here we see Rome becoming the preeminent church, and thus the Bishop of Rome becoming the preeminent bishop. So everybody now is aligned with whatever gets declared by the Bishop of Rome trickles down to the other churches. So that's how we got to that point. And so you'll see as things happen going forward, you'll see how this is all ingrained into the way the church is run. Now, we're not talking about the Roman Catholic Church yet, but this is where we get this organization. We're talking about the Orthodox Church, which is not technically declared the Orthodox Church until a few hundred years later, but this is the church that we would be following in this time. It's not the Gnostics or anything like that. The blessed apostles then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in the epistles to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus. And then he goes through the entire lineage. He goes through all the bishops of Rome to establish the precedent, to establish that the Bishop of Rome has a clear line all the way back to Paul, even though Peter was considered the first Bishop of Rome. So now there's a little change of direction here, so you can kind of see how we got one more principle to establish, and that's this one. And it comes, the first good example that we have of it is Cyprian. Cyprian was the Bishop of Carthage after the time of Tertullian, but he knew Tertullian, he would have known Tertullian, because that's where Tertullian was from, Carthage. He was very instrumental in a controversy that changed the church forever, which we're getting ready to talk about. But this phrase, this Latin phrase here, salus extra ecclesiam non est, is very important, and I'll tell you what that means next week. These three people represent three different positions in this controversy that I'm talking about. Stephen was a pope, Cyprian was bishop of Carthage, and Novatian wanted to be a pope. And they had three extremes. This was an extreme, that was an extreme, and Cyprian's in the middle. First of all, this proclamation by the Emperor Caracalla in 212 changed the way people became Romans. At this time, and in the time that you're all familiar with, it wasn't a common thing to be a Roman citizen. You had to be a citizen of Rome and born to a citizen of Rome to be Roman. So most of the people in the Roman Empire were not Romans. They were second-class citizens, in essence. This declaration in 212 changed all that. This was amnesty. In our day, we would call this amnesty. If you lived in Rome and you weren't a slave and you didn't come to Rome by being taken captive in a war, that kind of thing, then you were made a citizen. So now everybody, in relative terms, in the Roman Empire was a citizen. And as long as you were born within the Roman Empire, you were a citizen of Rome. And you had all the rights that came with that. Now, was he just a gracious emperor and decided he wanted everybody to be a Roman because it would be a nice thing? No, emperors didn't do things like that. He had a second motive, at least a second motive, and that involved what it usually involves, money, because the empire needed money, and if you make people citizens, their tax structure changes on them. So they end up contributing more money to the empire. And it had religious implications as well, and several other things. Because the way the Roman religion worked is you sacrifice to the gods, and the more sacrifices there were to the gods, the better off you would be. So if you make everybody a citizen, there will be more citizens sacrificing to the gods, so the gods will get that many more sacrifices, so you should be that much better off. So there were intricacies to all of this. That changed the orientation of church members too, because now not only are you just in the Roman Empire, you are a Roman citizen in the Roman Empire, and if Rome says you have to do something, you're more inclined to have to do it than if you were just present. So that led to, in 250, the emperor declared a persecution against. This Decian persecution is the first Roman Empire-wide persecution. There were persecutions that were more localized before this, but this is the first one that swallowed every Christian. And what he said was, you had to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. And if you didn't, you could be persecuted in some way, imprisoned, exiled, or killed. So there were a lot of Christians killed in this persecution. Among other things, having your property confiscated and that sort of thing. He didn't do it to get Christians, he did it to get the sacrifices to the gods, because things weren't going well militarily for the empire, so he was trying to get more sacrifice to the gods. So it was a loyalty oath to the emperor. And the way you proved your loyalty oath to the emperor was to do a religious sacrifice. The only people exempt, there were people who were exempted. The only people exempted from this were the Jews. Because the Jews had struck a deal with Julius Caesar that they were different from everybody else, and they didn't have to follow the Roman religion. So when you get to this point, the Jews are accepted, and they don't have to do it, but Christians aren't considered Jews anymore. So the Christians were forced to do this. If you did what you were supposed to do, you could get a certificate saying, I did this. So everybody was trying to get a certificate. So there were Christians that got certificates that didn't get them because they did a sacrifice. They got them, guess how?
They paid somebody to do
Because they paid somebody to get one for them. So the rich Christians were able to dodge this. And then there were, other ways that people got around it. There were several different ways to get around it. This only lasted about a year. And so what comes after that is something called the lapsi controversy, because a lot of Christians did something to get out of doing the sacrifice, short of saying, I'm not going to do the sacrifice. Because if you said you weren't going to do the sacrifice, you paid the penalties, which was death for some, imprisonment for others, confiscation, that kind of thing. So now that's all okay. Everything's in the past. It's okay to go back to being Christian. And a lot of people wanted to go back to being Christians. So what are you going to do with those people? Now we got all these people who said they weren't Christians to avoid the penalty. Now they want to be Christians again. And now remember, you've got to keep this in mind, because this is not the way our brain works. How did these people become Christians in the first place? They were baptized. That's the only way you could be a Christian. You got baptized. Somebody baptized you, you became a Christian. So, because we don't think of it that way, but by this time, that's how you become a Christian. You get baptized into the Christian church. So, these people were baptized. Then they said they weren't Christians. Now they were back, and their argument is, I was baptized. I'm still a Christian, even though I said I wasn't a Christian.
They were sacrificing to God, but then government was taking the money and using the money as the God.
Mm-hmm. So in essence, even if they did the sacrifice, the argument is we didn't mean it. We were just doing it to save ourselves. And is that really wrong? Because we are baptized. So now we got to work all this out. And that ends up making some major changes. So that's where we'll pick it up next week.